About 20 miles inland from Daytona Beach, there is a public road surfaced in brick that is 9 feet wide. It has no center line. It never had one. There was never room for two cars. Every brick carries the same stamp on its face, Graves Baham ALA. If you meet a vehicle coming the other way, one of you pulls into the scrub and waits. Not a farm track, not a driveway. For about 10 years, this was the main road into Florida. By the mid-1920s, private booster clubs had named more than 250 highways across America. The Yellowstone Trail, the Jefferson Highway, the Old Spanish Trail. Almost every one of those names is gone, and almost none of them had to be removed. They simply stopped being said because a number was easier, and nobody was invested in the word. This is the one that had to be taken off the map deliberately, county by county, by people voting in public meetings. Two things I'll come back to. The numbering system on every U.S. highway shield in America was designed by a man who told the country's biggest road club to their faces which highways it was built to erase, and in 1926, a group of women paid $800 for a metal stamp. Almost everything ever made with it has since been either stolen in the night or taken down by a government. Stay with me for that second one. This is the Dixie Highway, 10 states, Michigan to Miami. The road is mostly still here. The name is the part that keeps getting removed. To understand why anyone built this thing, you have to understand the problem, and the problem was not a mountain. Every piece of long-distance infrastructure that existed in 1914 ran east to west, the National Road. The trunk railroads out of Chicago and New York, the Lincoln Highway, which was then brand new. The Appalachian chain runs southwest to northeast, which is convenient if you are traveling along the spine and punishing if you are trying to cross it. But the deeper problem was simpler than terrain. The country's long-haul infrastructure went one way, and the money wanted to go the other. Below the mountains, the coastal plain from Georgia into Florida is flat, which sounds easy and is not. It is sand, palmetto root, and standing water. In 1909, Florida claimed 17,579 miles of public road. Of that, 581 miles were packed sand clay. 278 were marl or stone, 242 were gravel, 110 were shell. Outside of Duval County, there was essentially no brick and no concrete at all. In Northeast Florida, the specific obstacle was water. The line the contractors were handed ran through the Big Cypress Swamp and Pringle Swamp north of Espanola, and the engineers admitted afterward that this 5-mile stretch was the only part of the entire county job that gave them real trouble. So the route hugged the Florida East Coast Railway embankment, not for the view. The railway had already done the expensive work of finding and holding a dry line through a wet country, and the bricks arrived by train, so they could be tipped straight off the cars onto the roadside. The tourist logic ran in the opposite direction from the geography. The point was to connect the money, Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, to the product, which was Florida in February. There was no natural corridor between those two things, so the route was assembled the way that decade assembled everything, by stitching together whatever existing county roads could be persuaded, one bond referendum at a time, to improve themselves. 3 constraints shaped this corridor, and none of them was landscape. The first was that there was no federal money and no federal authority. The Federal Aid Road Act did not pass until 1916, and its funding mechanism did not become serious until 1921. Before that, an interstate road could only exist if a private association talked dozens of separate county governments into each passing a bond issue and building their own piece, which is exactly what happened. The Dixie Highway Association built nothing and paid for nothing. It published a monthly magazine out of Chattanooga. It painted the letters D and H on utility poles, white on a red band. It ran publicity motorcades, and it lobbied Congress. The road itself came out of local bond votes, $650,000 in St. Johns County alone. The second constraint was that the route was set by politics rather than engineering. Unlike the Lincoln Highway Association, which chose its own line, the Dixie Highway's route was decided by commissioners appointed 2 per state by the governors. Atlanta fought Savannah, Orlando fought Tampa, Daytona fought Jacksonville. On the 22nd of May, 1915, the commission resolved it by refusing to choose, adopting 2 parallel main lines with east-west connectors between them, so a tourist could drive south on one and home on the other, and still say truthfully they had driven the Dixie Highway. The shape of the road was the shape of the argument. That decision, made for political peace, is the single reason the road could not be given one number 11 years later. The third constraint was labor, and I'll come back to that properly. The 9-foot width was not cheapness. It was the width one crew with one steamroller could lay at a mile a month per work point, and the contract required 3 work points running at once. It was wide enough for a Model T. It was not wide enough for 2. In January 1914, St. Johns County advertised bids for 64 miles of road. The specification read, asphalt macadam, concrete, vitrified paving brick, or other suitable material, 9 feet wide, from outside to outside of 4 by 10-inch concrete curbing. In February, the contract went to the J.Y. Wilson Construction Company of Jacksonville for $527,155.20. Engineering went to the J.B. McCrary Company of Atlanta. In April, the bond referendum passed, 822 to 432. In Bunnell, the vote was 87-2. In Espanola, all 18 eligible voters voted yes. In August, Wilson ordered 5 million bricks, plus a road grader and a scraper, and supplied his own roller. Most of the brick was vitrified paver from the Graves Brick Company of Birmingham, Alabama, delivered by rail, with mule teams as the fallback where the railway didn't reach. Curb and bricklaying began at Durban and Hastings that October. It did not go smoothly. In July 1915, the county passed a resolution discharging the engineering firm, alleging its engineers had been absent while brick was laid between Bunnell and Espanola, that bricks had been laid on beds that were never watered before rolling, and that bricks had been laid directly over palmetto roots. The dispute settled. McCrary agreed to repairs, and the county held back $2,000 for 60 days. By August 1915, they had 57 miles down. On the 4th of March, 1916, the St. Augustine Record declared the Dixie Highway complete through St. Johns County. Final paved mileage, 66 miles. Here's the detail that tells you what this actually was to the people who paid for it. When the road was finished, they left one brick unlaid, deliberately, so that at the formal ceremony, there would be something for a dignitary to do. Wilson's crew celebrated with 160 pounds of pork and 40 loaves of bread. Espanola in 1920 had 385 people in the precinct. It had C.P. Hendry running an automobile garage, C.E. Pappy, grocer, T.F. Witten, general store, S.L. Strickland in naval stores. And through the 20s and 30s, L.Z. Hunter operated something along the highway called the Live and Let Live Tourist Camp, which is the entire economic posture of the era in 5 words. A town of 385 people does not support a car garage unless the road is the reason the town exists. The man who made it happen was I. Moody Jr. of Bunnell. He arrived in St. Johns County in 1898 to work in turpentine, moved into lumber, then real estate, founded the Bunnell Development Company in 1909, chaired the county commission in 1913 and 1914, and drove the bond issue through. In 1917, he organized Bunnell and Espanola to lobby the legislature into creating an entirely new county, Flagler, and then represented it. He died in 1918. He got a highway and a county out of 4 years and did not live to see either one mature. One more small thing. Through 1915, out-of-state motorists kept getting lost between St. Augustine and Ormond Beach because the signs still pointed toward the old destinations and the drivers were using outdated maps. They kept taking the King's Road, which was not paved. New signs carrying the DH emblem went up late that year specifically to stop it. Real quick, if you're getting something out of this, the best thing you can do is watch it through or hit subscribe. That's it. Back to the road. The man whose name is attached to all of this is Carl Fisher, and Fisher never spent $1 building the Dixie Highway. He had sold his Presto Light Headlight Company to Union Carbide for $9 million around 1910. He put money into the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Then he bought into a mangrove bank across the water from Miami with a man named John Collins. The Dixie Highway ran south to Miami and terminated at the Collins Bridge across Biscayne Bay, a toll bridge Fisher had personally paid to finish, which delivered northern motorists directly onto land Fisher owned. At the peak in 1925, his fortune was estimated somewhere between $50 and $100 million. The traffic numbers are what make the case. In September 1915, one observer counted 453 cars using the Dixie Highway in Florida. The following month, 647. In the winter season of 1924 to 1925, The Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce counted 150,000 out-of-state automobiles coming through the city. In August of 1925 alone, they counted 12,550 cars, carrying 49,118 people heading south out of Jacksonville. 10 years, 453 cars a month to 12,500. Florida's population went from 968,000 in 1920 to over 1,260,000 by 1925. Before this road, reaching the Florida East Coast meant Henry Flagler's Railway, on Flagler's schedule, at Flagler's price. The Dixie Highway ended that monopoly, while running parallel to Flagler's tracks, on the dry line Flagler's engineers had found, using Flagler's freight cars to deliver the bricks. Now, the labor, because this is the part the postcards left out. In 1908, Georgia abolished convict leasing after decades of scandal over deaths in privately run mines and camps. The reform did not free anyone. It moved roughly 5,000 felony and misdemeanor convicts, 91% of them black, out of the hands of private lessees and into county road gangs, distributed by the state on a quota. Progressive reformers advertised this as the humane option. Prisoners were moved between counties in cages, worked sunup to sundown, and housed in temporary camps at the worksite. Between 1910 and 1915, those crews doubled Georgia's improved road mileage. Florida had 628 prisoners in 24 road camps by January 1921. North Carolina had more than 2,400 on county chain gangs by October 1926. The Dixie Highway Association's own literature advocated expert engineering, paid labor, and modern machinery. Southern states ignored it, and the reason was not sentiment. Chain gangs let a county build roads without levying new taxes or issuing bonds, and preserved a local instrument of racial control at the same time. The saying recorded in Georgia at the time was, "Bad boys make good roads," and it is documented on this specific road, line by line, in street. Johns County, the engineering firm set the levels and grades. Convicts graded the roadbed, and the paving contractors paid crews laid the curb and brick behind them. The county supplied the transport, an 18-berth portable steel cage. In November 1917, Flagler County assigned its road superintendent to keep a convict force working the brick highway to finish what the contractor would not come back for. So how does a 9-foot brick road actually fail? Not by wearing out. Vitrified brick is extremely hard. The failure is underneath it, and it runs in a sequence. A loaded vehicle passes, the sand and palmetto subgrade pumps under the load, and individual bricks tilt and settle below the plane of their neighbors. Once the mat is no longer flat, the only thing holding it in lateral compression is the curb. The curb cracks, and then the road unzips from the edges inward. Wilson's grooved interlocking curb design existed precisely to fight this. The county's 5-ton truck weight limit existed for the same reason, and it was in force before a single vehicle used the road. And the complaints of July 1915 name the exact precursors. Brick laid on beds that were never watered before rolling. Brick laid over palmetto roots. Palmetto root does not compress. It rots, and then it leaves a void. Across the wider system, the failure mode was cruder. Weather washed out unpaved sections faster than counties could rebuild them. When the association dissolved, large stretches of the Dixie Highway were still dirt. The modern failure mode on this corridor is entirely different, and it is much better documented because a piece of the Dixie Highway is still one of the busiest roads in Louisville, Kentucky. That stretch is a multi-lane arterial with commercial frontage on both sides and bus stops on both sides. Before it was rebuilt, the crosswalks were far enough apart that crossing mid-block was the rational choice. In January 2019, a woman was struck and killed on it. The nearest legal crossing was roughly a quarter mile in either direction. Before the project, that corridor recorded about 3 times the crash rate of comparable Kentucky roadways, and a fatality rate 3 times higher. The fixes tell you the mechanism precisely. Raised concrete medians and dedicated left-turn-only lanes between Crumbs Lane and Greenwood Road to eliminate unprotected left turns across oncoming traffic and the head-on collisions that follow. 8-foot sidewalks and marked crossings to give pedestrians somewhere legal to be. At the rebuilt Watterson Expressway ramp alone, a Metro Council member reported crashes down about 80%. People in Louisville call that road the Dixie Highway. Business owners on it use the phrase, so do the elected officials trying to fix it. The ledger on this road is uneven, and the honest thing is to say where it goes blank. Nobody has a count of the men who died building it. Not because it was safe. The records I could reach simply do not carry the number, and I am not going to invent one for you. What is countable is the labor system itself, and those figures are in the previous section, and they are not small. The institution died on schedule. The Dixie Highway Association dissolved in 1927, its functions absorbed by state road departments and Federal Highway Administration. The man died slowly. Carl Fisher divorced in 1926. The September 1926 hurricane hit Miami Beach. He was already overextended building a second resort at Montauk on Long Island, which went into receivership in 1932. By 1933, he was wiped out. He died on the 15th of July, 1939, aged 65, of complications of alcoholism in a small house in the city he had built. And a corridor-wide fatality count for the modern road is not possible, because the modern road runs through 10 states under a dozen different numbers. That fragmentation is not an accident. It was the point. Here's the part that makes this different from every other bypassed road. The Dixie Highway was not killed by a better road. It was killed by a committee on purpose, and the men who did it wrote down what they were doing. On the 20th of November, 1924, the American Association of State Highway Officials passed a resolution calling for a uniformly marked system of interstate routes, calling for a halt to the naming of highways by trail associations, and formally warning American citizens to investigate the responsibility of trail organizers before giving them any money. In February 1925, the Secretary of Agriculture approved a joint board on interstate highways, 21 state highway officials and 3 federal ones, chaired by the head of the Bureau of Public Roads, with an engineer named E.W. James as its secretary. At its first meeting, the joint board decided to publish its resolutions and hold no public hearings at all. The stated reason was that hearings would have required inviting the trail associations and would have made the board an arbitrator between them. When more than 50 associations sent representatives to the board's Kansas City meeting that May, they were told they could not address it. Board members went and spoke to them in a separate room of the hotel. Then James went to Detroit, to the Lincoln Highway Association, the strongest club of them all. He told them plainly that his plan would mean the end of the Lincoln Highway Association, the Dixie, and all others. They agreed to back him in exchange for the number 30 tracking their route. His own summary, years later, so had their support toward washing out all the named routes. His reasoning, they were the strongest of all the associations, and with them with us, who could be against us. The structural blow was quiet and total. No multi-state named trail would receive a single number. Everyone was broken across several. The Dixie Highway's western branch through Kentucky became US 31. The eastern branch became US 25. Under the board's own convention, a number ending in 1 meant a principal north-south route, and a 5 meant secondary. It was not just renumbered, it was renumbered and demoted. Kentucky's governor, William J. Fields, announced on the 8th of December, 1925, that his state would ignore the numbers entirely. The board refused to change the Dixie Highway's numbers, but it did move the number 60 to Kentucky to settle him, which left the Chicago to Los Angeles route without one. Missouri and Oklahoma revolted. They had already printed 600,000 maps. On the 30th of April, 1926, 2 of their officials wired Washington with a spare number nobody had used. We prefer 66 to 62, which brings us to what made the killing possible, because it was not a machine. It was money, and the statute behind it. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 created the first joint state and federal funding mechanism. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921 concentrated that money on a designated system covering 7% of each state's road network, of which 3/7 had to be interstate in character, funded 50-50. That system was designated by 1923. And once state and federal governments were jointly choosing and paying for the main roads, a private booster association had nothing left to sell. That is the whole mechanism. The Dixie Highway Association's product was persuasion, and persuasion stopped being scarce. The second enabler was scale. Registered motor vehicles in the United States went from under 500,000 in 1910 to nearly 10 million in 1920 to over 26 million by 1930. A signing system that worked for a few thousand adventurers does not work for 10 million commuters. The precedent was Wisconsin, which passed a law in 1917 and put numbered signs up statewide at an agreed hour on the 24th of May, 1918. The shield itself was doodled during the Joint Board's April 1925 meeting. Michigan's Frank Rogers sketched it on paper, James redrew it, and the board adopted it that afternoon at 16 inches from tip to tip. Then, on the 11th of November, 1926, at Pinehurst, North Carolina, AASHO adopted the U.S. numbered highway system. 96,626 miles. That was the moment. Not damaged, not bypassed, renumbered out of existence. The association dissolved the following year. The road that eventually replaced it physically came 30 years later, under the 1956 Act. Interstate 75 runs from Miami to Sault Ste. Marie, which are exactly the two endpoints of the Dixie Highway's eastern division. Interstate 65 parallels the western route. Interstate 95 took the Florida coast. By the mid-1930s, the name had largely dropped out of ordinary use, and the red and white DH signs had rusted off their posts. Because there had been two main lines, there was no single number to inherit. In Florida alone, the old alignments were split across US 1, 17, 27, 41, 98, 221, 319, and 441, plus assorted state roads. Espanola lost the road twice. The brick from Bunnell east toward Flagler Beach was destroyed outright and replaced with what is now State Road 100. The salvaged bricks were given away to local settlers, who used them for fireplaces and patios. Some went into the Bunnell Elementary School gymnasium. The stretch running north from Espanola survived for the least romantic reason available. Nobody bothered to remove it. It stayed state-maintained until the 1960s, when responsibility reverted to Flagler County. The places along it mostly stopped. Bird, Spuds, Herds, DuPont, Neoga, towns that existed because the railway cut through in the late 1800s, and the highway ran past in 1916. Further north, the same thing happened at a different scale. After Interstate 75 opened through western Ohio in 1963, the old road fragmented into County Road 25A, Dixie Drive, Cincinnati-Dayton Road, and through Dayton into Patterson Boulevard and Kiowa Street. One road, 5 names, none of them the original. Now the $800. In the mid-1920s, the North Carolina division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy raised $800 to have a die cast for a bronze plaque. The plaque read in relief that it was erected in loving memory of Robert E. Lee and to mark the route of the Dixie Highway. It carried an image of Lee on horseback. They bolted them to granite boulders along what is now US 25 through western North Carolina, and they were dated 1926. That is the same year the numbering system took the name off the map. About 10 were cast from that die. Several are unaccounted for. Here is what happened to the rest. The Tuxedo plaque was stolen in October 2017. A marker in Franklin, Ohio was removed in 2017. The Asheville marker was removed on the 10th of July 2020 by joint resolution of the city and the county. The Marshall plaque was stolen in early November 2020. The Hot Springs plaque was stolen in March 2022. In 2022, a church in Fletcher returned the one in front of it to the local chapter. The reason this matters is not the theft, it is the date. The Confederate reading of this road's name is not a modern reinterpretation applied by people in 2020. It was cast in bronze and bolted to the roadside within 11 years of the road being built, by people who wanted it there. Here is what's actually on the ground now. The old brick road runs from Espanola north to County Road 204, 10.6 miles by the county's own Cultural Resource Plan, 8.6 of them in Flagler County. It went on the National Register of Historic Places on the 20th of April, 2005. The approach is from Bunnell, a few miles west on County Road 13, through small farms and the Espanola Crossroads. You turn, there's a quarter mile of asphalt, and then the asphalt simply stops and brick begins. No gate, no plaque at the transition. The road just changes material under the tires. The surface is a mix of intact brick, packed sand, loose sand, and potholes that hold 2 feet of water after rain. The brick mat undulates where the subgrade has pumped. The concrete curb is chipped and in places gone entirely, and grass has closed in from both sides, so the road is now visibly narrower than the 9 feet it was built. There are no markings of any kind. There never were. 2 signs at the Espanola entrance. Travel at own risk. Removing bricks is illegal. Around it, pine flatwoods, palmetto at the shoulder, live oak and Spanish moss over the wet ground, cypress in the low places north of town. Nothing above eye level. It is extremely quiet. The main human sound is logging trucks, which are the road's principal users, and also the thing warping it. The section inside Bunnell is fenced at both ends. Part of it is reachable by a road called Forgotten Lane. Elsewhere, the name survived where the road became somebody's main street. Chicago South through Posen and Harvey and Homewood to Chicago Heights. Most of the Kentucky cities on US 31W Michigan extensively. Southwestern Bedford, Indiana, Dixie Lee Junction in Tennessee, where the Dixie Highway crossed the Lee Highway, and US 1 from the southern end of Interstate 95 in Miami all the way down to Key Largo, which is where the last part of this happens. In 2015, Riviera Beach in Palm Beach County renamed its stretch for Barack Obama. In 2019, a high school sophomore named Isabella Banos was in a car with her grandfather when the navigation system said, "Turn right on South Dixie Highway," and she asked him why it was called that. She wrote a letter to the Miami Times. Her grandfather emailed a draft resolution to all 13 county commissioners. On the 19th of February, 2020, it passed 13-0, and then it stalled on procedure. Under Florida law, renaming a state road takes an act of the legislature. Short of that, a road can be given an honorary designation, but only if every affected local government passes a supporting resolution. 9 of the 10 Miami-Dade municipalities did. Coral Gables voted it down, 2-3, in January 2021, and the bill covering 42 miles of US 1 died in that session. The Gables mayor who had voted against it revived it in May. On the 18th of September 2021, the signs went up near the Vizcaya Metro Rail station. 2 of them, 1 at each end. Between them, the word is still on the signs. The numbering system worked, and it is worth saying so without hedging. In 1925, a driver could cross Kansas on 6 overlapping named trails, and one stretch of road in New Mexico carried markers for 5 different highways at once. Wisconsin's state engineer described how you gave directions before numbers, forks in the road, schoolhouses, red barns, and after. Take number 12 until you meet number 21. One sentence, incapable of being misunderstood. That is a real and permanent gain. What was lost is harder to see. The trail associations were also the only mechanism by which a small town had any voice in where a highway went. After 1926, route selection moved inside state highway departments and a federal bureau that had explicitly decided not to hold hearings. The towns that lost their highway that year lost it in a room they were not allowed to enter, and were told about it afterward in a separate room of the same hotel. And the name. In 1915, this was not a Confederate tribute. It was a Midwestern headlight salesman's marketing instinct that the South was a product and Dixie was the brand. The historian Tammy Ingram's position is that this does not rescue the word. By the time Dixie reached the minstrel stage, it was already understood to mean a great deal more than a place. Both of those things are true at once, and any account that gives you only one of them is selling you something. 9 feet wide, 5 million bricks, 66 miles, for $650,000. And it was not badly built. The men who laid that brick were working with a steamroller, mule teams, and a subgrade of sand and palmetto root, and they built the best road that 1914 knew how to build on the only line the equipment could hold. Nothing about the brick failed. What made it obsolete was a funding statute and a numbering convention, neither of which had anything to do with the road. That's the thing about this one. The pavement is the cheapest part of a road. The expensive part is the argument about what to call it, and that argument outlives the pavement. Carl Fisher's other highway, the Lincoln, met the exact same fate in the exact same vote, and its association negotiated the number 30 as compensation, wound itself up voluntarily on the 1st of September 1928, and had the Boy Scouts plant 3,000 concrete markers along the route in a single day. The Lincoln Highway got a funeral. Route 66, which only has that number because of a fight the Dixie Highway lost, got a preservation movement. The Dixie Highway got an argument that is still going. If you grew up on a road called Dixie Highway, in Louisville, in Waterford, in Chicago Heights, in Homestead, tell me in the comments what the name meant to you before you knew where it came from, and whether anybody ever mentioned it used to run all the way to Michigan.